All right, everybody. I'm very excited for another episode of Martial Praxis. I'm joined again by Rolando Garcia. He's the founder of the Estocada Method. He has an incredible martial arts pedigree, and I'm really excited to have him back on. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be speaking with you about this.
Yeah, man. Honestly, after our last conversation, our last two conversations, it's led to so much development in my training and my way of thinking. So I'm really appreciative too. So I gotta thank you for that.
You're
Um,
welcome.
and
Thank you.
hopefully this one goes even further. So today, I wanted to kind of start because last time we kind of focused on your background in Filipino martial arts and also talked a little bit about Jeet Kune Do. Um, but you have an extensive training in Japanese swordsmanship as well, which I think is a really amazing counterpoint to the Filipino martial arts. Do you think you could kind of talk to us a little bit about your training in Japanese martial art, Japanese swordsmanship,
Yeah,
and what that entailed?
yeah. I got very lucky, because it's usually when you receive this type of knowledge transmission, it's really still very dependent on the sensei, the group, the type of quality of instruction, but also the energy that they provide, right? And I got very lucky with finding Shihan Shihan Masami Shioda, who is the head instructor of Shinkage-ryu Marubashikai here in New York City, and his their approach. This is a koryu art, which means this is for your audience. This is one of the great koryu Japanese swordsmanship schools, in that this is pre-Edo period, because when it was during the Edo period, a lot of the swords were modified as per the shogun. A lot of the no more there was no fighting between samurai that was allowed. No more battlefield fights as well, and so no more battlefield warfare. So anything before that was considered old technology.
Yes.
So Shinkage-ryu is considered one of the great ones, along with Katori Shinto-ryu and Ito-ryu.
Yes.
Um, and um, and so when I received it, when I first met my sensei in 2017, uh, it was really eye-opening in just how technical they were.
Mm.
And one of the interest, he is also a Zen practitioner. I believe he's also a Zen priest. And it was something that I got lucky, that before each class, he invited me to a 20-minute meditation prior to the class. One is really, just to center the being, but also to kind of center the space. So I was
Yes.
like, hey, Sensei, is it all right if I join? Oh, yes, of course. So it was like 20 minutes of this it's a very specific practice that I use still to this day. But aside from that, it was a very, very technical class. Like I'm going to take the Fukuro Shinai, which is what we use for practice. As you can see, it's very beat up because it's a lot of contact. But
Hmm.
they would correct you, like, you know, here versus here. And they'll just tell you, because you're going to get hit. You'll get the immediate feedback. So a
Yeah.
lot of that school wasn't about necessarily about propagating the mythology of the samurai, the image of the samurai. It was technical. They'll just, you might want to move your hand here. Okay, you might want to move your wrist this way. You might want to turn your shoulder this way. Okay, try it. And then, of course, Shidashi will go, like, you just hit you full force. And if you were off, you the thing just fell into your face, right? Or your whole structure will collapse. But if you were on, you felt that energy receive into your structure, and you're just like, oh. So that's what alignment means. So overall, that was my experience at Shinkage-ryu. I'll admit that I was training every week for about a year, because the
Mm.
classes are offered once a year. So I owe a lot of my training to Shihan Masami Shioda, but also my wonderful senpais, Senpai Jose, Senpai Vernon, Senpai Ignacio, and Senpai Jake. They were like these wonderful, like, brown belts who will pull you
Yeah.
aside and say, actually, let me show you this detail. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
awesome.
No, that can really help. You need that sometimes.
Yes, yes, yes.
It's very cool. So, When it comes to it's such an interesting experience, and it's something that I don't know that that everybody's had, which is that when you're in that perfect alignment, how when you hit somebody who's like that, or somebody hits you, it's like they're just hitting the floor. I mean, they just bounce right off of you. It's kind of spooky. It almost feels, a little bit like what just happened that wasn't real. But it's just structure and physics, and they can't get into your structure, and everything's aligned in one piece. But it's such a it's such an eye-opening experience as a martial artist because you learn all these techniques and you start to think that everything's technical, and then all of a sudden you go to like hit one of these people who have this really, really good structure, and you're like, wait, like none of the moves work. What's going on?
Exactly.
And it's
I
like,
I
oh,
love I love that you shared that because the first time I really experienced that was in Shinkage-ryu. I was kind of shocked. Now, just a little background on my sensei. He has a kendo experience too.
mm,
So he was like, "Well, this is kendo. I'm gonna do something that's from kendo. Now I'm gonna do something that's from Shinkage-ryu." And it was, I mean, just remembering it, makes the hair on the back of my neck just go up because he's like, let me show you the difference between speed and structure. And he'll hit you with just speed, right? Then he'll present structure. And you just picked the great word spooky. That it's
yeah,
spooky because he will look like he's not moving, but you can sense he is. You're like, my eyes are telling me one thing, but your body's like, no, 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 he's moving. You got to get out of the way. And when he hit me with the Fukuro Shinai on my wrist, it's just like what Takuan Soho says in his book, in his letters to Yagyu Muninori, compiled as The Unfettered Mind. It's like the sword didn't exist in time and space. But this is not theoretical. You experience it.
yeah,
Like the next thing you know, the next memory you have is that you just felt it on your hand. And then when it comes back, your, sensei is back in his structure. But
yeah,
when you got hit by that, it's like something transferred into you.
yes. Yeah, I think that I think part of what happens, and this is just my own take on some of this, is that I look at it as dynamic systems, and I think from the perspective of the nervous system, and also somewhat what goes beyond the nervous system, because they're starting to realize that there is activity that we would attribute to the nervous system that goes on outside of it. Like cells can communicate directly with each other. Plants seem to have some of these nervous system functions without having neurons. So how do you have neurology without a neuron, right?
Right?
So there's this very, very, very fascinating, thing here of how do we start to pick this apart, where we look at and say, what is it that changes and develops when we develop memory or skill, you
Hmm.
know? And how does that happen so that we can have this structure, Like it's so fascinating because you look at people who train in, say, an art that doesn't focus on, and I think one of the things that creates this skill that we're talking about is posture, right? When you
Yeah.
train postures, that by training and pressure testing a posture, you can really develop this ability to bounce someone off of you. And there's this question of like, what is it that changes about the person?
Yeah.
Like where does that change happen,
You're when those things happen, when you experience it, especially when you're on the receiving end of it, of somebody really highly skilled, right? Sensei James Williams, who I had a few interactions with at Blade Show, he has a Systema background among his plethora of just systems he's been exposed to. He shared with me his energy. Like, here, I'm going to do this to you. I'm going to place this on your clavicle, and it's going to move you this way. And when he did this little movement, it was very soft. Um, in that he didn't go like he didn't get all external about it. He did something internally, and I flew back about a good 5 feet. Right. Uh, but it wasn't that I flew back. I felt his energy restructure me internally, and I had to move back, right? So but then to your point, what did that impact, not just in terms of the anatomy, what did that impact in me, like from a myofascial standpoint, my breath, What did that do to my nervous system in my ability to reorganize myself? So that's you raise good questions there, because I had those same questions around 2016, 2017, and which got me into Shinkage-ryu.
And I think also, it's interesting in my way of understanding some of the stuff, kind of going back to the nervous system and the stuff that goes beyond it a little bit, is like when you're in contact with another human, right? A lot of it has to do with connection. Like you need something to be happening to create that connection, and it can be physical, right? Like we can be physically touching, but also like eye contact
Oh yeah,
or like a common objective, right? Like if we're contesting over a piece of space, right? Like we both want to move through the same piece of space, right? When we enter into this connection with another person, um, there is this ability to communicate non-verbally. And I think that it's so easy to go, oh my God, this is woo-woo, this is that. And it does have a lot to do with ki or chi or prana, but in the same way that we say like a dancer can communicate non-verbally with the audience, right? We're doing that in these encounters, right? And depending on how you kind of do that, you can actually start to manipulate time and space. And one of the things that I've noticed with this is you can bring a certain kind of energy to a movement. It works very well with like a straight ski, like with a kendo sword, where you just kind of are dead before you go to move. Like you just bring your energy really, really low and down. And when you go to move, you just don't allow any excitation. You just go straight forward. And the other person basically doesn't recognize that you moved because there was no signal. So it's
yeah,
like bring that telegraph way down. This is just one example, like a feint is another great example where you make a really loud signal and then you hide the next thing underneath it because the person's reacting to that loud, the ki or the movement, right? So there's many strategies for this, but what I'm ultimately trying to get at is like we communicate non-verbally with the opponent. So sometimes when you have that experience of like, wow, this person just like crossed the barrier between us without me noticing, right? If and it feels spooky that there was some communication going on there, and they were able to mask it so you didn't hear it so loudly.
yeah, yeah, and that's something that was not discussed in my training in Shinkage-ryu. And just to qualify it, so that I want to make sure that your audience is aware,
Yeah,
in that my training in Shinkage-ryu may be comprised about a year's worth of training, right?
yeah,
And my own rank in the system didn't get very high. I'd say maybe about a two-stripe blue belt kind of level. I have an O, I have an O Marubashikai ranking, which is like there's I think Marubashi and then there's O Marubashi, and I have the
yeah,
second. And I started to study. I think the forms, the kata that came after that, the two-man set. So that's the
yeah, yeah,
background. I
totally. Yeah,
just want to share that. But that said, to your point, what you're talking about reminds me of the discoveries that were made by Italian researchers in the early 90s around mirroring neurons, meaning we have a set of neurons in the body where, like you right now, you just did this movement with your beard. When I see something like that, the same exact muscular sequence fires in me simply because they're mirroring neurons. We
yes,
don't yet know from an evolutionary standpoint why mirroring neurons even came about. Um, they had a very interesting way of testing it on monkeys in a very humane way, where they discovered this. But this is where how some power lifters, when they're in competition, they're highly aware of mirroring neurons, so that when they're preparing for a lift, their coaches tell them, don't look at the next person who's lifting because you're going to exhaust yourself. Because when you see someone
yes.
going for a max lift, your mirroring neurons are also going for a max lift. And if you're at
Wow.
a meet, you see like hundreds of those,
Yeah, yeah,
hundreds of
yeah.
deadlifts,
Wow.
hundreds of squats. So this mechanism of a mirroring neuron is you have to be careful what you observe, be careful what you bring. And I know that I explored this a lot in powerlifting and kettlebell lifting, But by the time I got into Japanese swordsmanship and I graduated, and at the same time I was refining my own Filipino swordsmanship through Illustrissimo, interestingly also through Burton Richardson,
Mm,
I was refining my knowledge of mirroring neurons. So this energy you speak of, like when, let's say, you and I are about to roll, there's a lot of excitation in jiu-jitsu, right? You know, when
yeah.
you're start from the knees or when you're competing. By the time a sword is introduced or any edged weapons is introduced, it's a very different energy. It's one thing with a Bowie knife. It's one thing with a folding knife. It's it gets spooky with a Japanese sword.
Yeah.
And I will add even a Filipino sword, but more so, in my opinion, with a Japanese sword. There's something that happens with that energy connection and the mirroring neurons that I haven't yet been able to put into words. But it's you. I think you came up with the best word. It's there's a spooky feeling.
Yeah, I think that, in my training in Chinese uh martial arts, one of the things they talk about with weapons is that there's sort of like an alchemy between the person and the weapon. Like part of their approach to weapons beyond it just being weapons training, right, is that they're also like training tools to develop, your other martial arts, your empty hand and stuff. So I think that, you know, with wood weapons, there's a certain kind of energy. With metal weapons, there's a certain kind of energy, but that with the katana, like there's this very specific, I would call it like a killing energy, right? And they'll talk about that metal weapons are especially good for that. And then even with a bokken, right? Like you kind of know that like, yeah, this is a piece of wood, but it's representing this deadly metal weapon, right? So I think that
Mm,
the some of that comes from a combination of like some of it's coming from the practitioner. It's a mixture of the practitioner's energy and the weapon's energy, and it kind of I think the Japanese sword especially has this propensity for this kind of grave energy, this very serious grave energy, right? Like if you contrast it with jujitsu, it's totally different. You go to jujitsu, it's kind of like maybe you're a little bit like, oh, we're gonna fight, but it's not. There's nothing grave about it. When the katanas come out, it's like someone's gonna die.
die.
Yeah.
I love that you shared this because again I want to go back to the Fukuro Shinai, right? Even though this is a wood and it's wrapped in leather, when we would train, that intentionality was always reminded. We were always reminded of it. We'll say, hey, you make this mistake here when that other samurai comes down this way, you try to block in this kind of namby-pamby way, you're going to get hit by your own sword. It might even get embedded in your face, right? Um, but from an energetic standpoint, I'll share this with you because I have the Filipino perspective, and then you have the Japanese perspective, but I also have this perspective, the American Bowie knife. There is a lot of energy, and I think it has a lot to do with there's several energies involved. One, the maker, right? So we've all heard about those stories about Muramasa, right? Muramasa, who was like apparently crazy and he would wish all types of ill on the sword, and how the Japanese sword would do all this type of harm. He preyed on that, right? When, as he was making the sword, apparently. At least that's the mythology that's passed on to us about Muramasa, who is supposedly a Japanese genius when it came to the making of swords. So one, the energy and intention of the maker. Number two, the energy and intention of the sword owner, right? So if let's say I get to handle a sword that was from 400 years ago, the real question is how many hands have had that? What was their energy and intention? Was it a ceremonial sword and it just hung on a wall? Or was this like, held by a really intense person who may or may not have used it? Was he abusive? So that energy transfers to the sword. But the third one, and I think both the Japanese and Filipinos have this, the sword itself has its own energy, right? So I'll share three perspectives on this. The first one, when I recently visited the Mystic Knife Show, there were several vendors there who had, with paperwork, older Japanese swords from the 1600s and 1700s. And I'll share this with you. I have a feeling that since they were closer to Edo period, they didn't necessarily have that kind of intense samurai, wow, that did their thing. Because when I handled them, there was a bit of there's a little bit of wow, that's really amazing. For one thing, the balance was very unique, very superb. Uh, but the energy I got from it was, oh wow, this is amazing. Like there's this beautiful sense of appreciation. And then you have the Filipino side. One of my coaches, Coach Narzo Arnold, he's the head instructor of Kalis Sumo. He said, you have to be careful with the kind of Filipino sword that you pick because some of them can have their own temper.
Mhm.
And in his words, he said, sometimes they thirst for blood. And the word that he used was mainit. And mainit in Tagalog means hot. So the sword's a little hot, meaning it's thirsting for blood. And this was a conversation he and I had in while he was staying at Mark Rubio's house. And not Mark Rubio, Mike Rubio's house. Mike Rubio, who's the founder of FMA Supply. So he said that if you're working with an antique sword and mainit, like it's kind of like thirsting for blood, you got to cut yourself with the sword and then
Mm.
pour some of your own blood on the sword so that its thirst is quenched.
Calm it down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
calm it down. Yeah, I love that you said that because that is what he said. Calm it down so that it doesn't now impact your energy and you don't end up, walking around the neighborhood like, with a Sansibar like this. Like now you and the sword are supposedly one. Well, it took over your energy, right? So that's
Yeah.
the Filipino version of it. But interestingly, Bill Bagwell, the one who's made a lot of my custom Bowie knives, said the exact same thing. And this is an American from Texas,
Mm.
said the same thing. So he said things that Filipinos would say. He said, one, he told me, Rolando, never name your knife, never give it a name. And he was talking to me on the phone about it. And then I said, oh, okay, yeah, I won't do that, Bill. And I thought that was the end of it. But then he said, um, it will tell you its name. Whoa! So he went into that realm. I thought he was just don't give
Yeah.
it a name, don't give it that woo woo stuff. But then he went even more woo woo. He
Yeah.
said,
Yeah.
it will tell you that its name. It's like, it's like my arms were just like, oh my god, it was covered in goosebumps. And he said that it has its own soul. You have to get to know the knife, not just from a technical standpoint, but get to know it almost like a person, right? And I experienced this very recently with my very good friend Bobby Rains. He's a wonderful knife maker, and he's actually become really big now. He made this beautiful Bowie knife for me. He named the Fire Child, and even now, like as I hold it, I feel the energy going through because of all the Bowie knives I have. This is the one that's like, let's just go, let's move, let's go. The first time I moved with it, like even right now, I'm going to try to get it in front of the camera, even as I do back cuts with it, I can feel like this energy going through my arm into my mid back. Like it just wants to keep going. But I believe it's the energy that Bobby put onto the knife, the excitement that he had. Um, and I know that he smokes cigars when he makes my knives. So it's like, and I'm a cigar smoker also. So I think he puts so much of his energy here. It's very positive. But to your point, how much of this practice is technical? How much of it is energetic? How much of it is what we're receiving from the tool? How much of
So
it we're receiving from the maker? And how much of it we're giving onto it?
I think it's interesting, in some ways, the idea that maybe the energetic and the technical components are two sides of the same coin. Like when it comes to say, the katanas, right? When you handle that like mid-period katana and it has that particular energy of, oh, this is a beautiful piece. It's it's almost giving that in some ways is reflected in its technical dimensions, right? Like it's a knife that is made with the intent and prowess of a knife maker who's made swords that kill people, but it hasn't been used for that. So maybe some of the things that the little things, does the blood drip off the suba a certain way and it stains does it stain the cloth that wraps the handle? Like I think that you'll see these little things that maybe are indicative of stuff like that. And there's this
Mhm.
kind of overlap between what happens on the energetic level with what you're feeling from it and also the technical dimensions. Like with the Bowie knife that you were just talking about, uh, it's ergonomic. Its physical presence is a perfect match to the energy that was placed into it, right? And I think that's part of why it feels so powerful.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll speaking of that, the power that it has. When you mentioned like the Edo period kind of sword versus pre-Edo, one of the life-changing moments I had was when the Metropolitan Museum, I think, worked with the museum in Japan, where they took the entire collection from Japan, armor, the bow and arrows, the swords that they had from even as far back as the 1100s. They shipped everything to the Met, and the name the of it was The Art of the Samurai. They have this wonderful book on it, but I was there for like 2 or 3 days, and this was the first time I really felt energy in a martial sense. And in my memory, I could be remembering it correctly, but in my memory, there were three things that stood out. One was when I walked into the armor room, right? It has its own armor room, but this one is the one from Japan. I walked in, and in my memory, no one else was there. It was just the armor. And I'm looking at armor from the 1300s and 1400s, and the way they were set up, I can imagine how it must have stopped a person's heart being on the same battlefield as samurai, because I was just looking at the armor. It was like rows and rows and rows of armor.
Yeah.
I thought, what it must have been like to be surrounded by men like this.
Yeah.
Uh, and from what I understand, there were women samurai also. So, but
Wow.
just samurai, it almost stopped my heart. I thought, this is terrifying, but it's wonderful. You're in awe of it. So there was that energy, but the one that stood out was there were so many swords presented, in their bare blade, but there was one. It's almost like in the anime movie. Oh, it was one of those. There was one sword from across the room, almost like it was saying, "Come here, come here." And I remember it was like there was like a bright light to it, and I was like, "Oh, yeah, I'm gonna go say hi to you, whatever." I looked at it, and I just kept looking at it. It was like I was looking into this pool of light. I was like, "What is this amazing thing?" And I looked at the little descriptor of it to the bottom. It's the very famous sword called Crying Fox. Crying Fox is one of the oldest and most famous swords in Japan because it's about 900 years old. Uh, and it has been the sword of basically every emperor, every shogun afterwards. And apparently it survived the fire, among other things. And I remember the sensation of thinking, how many hands, how many memories, how many summers, how many practices, or how many people has this sword killed, uh, to get to my eyes. I felt humbled, I felt connected, I felt all of these mixture of things. But it was in that kind of presence where I started to understand the appreciation that Japanese people have for their history, but also their martial art.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. Like, it was like, where does this, because there's a very unique energy and etiquette and demeanor in especially in the koryu arts, right? In these
Yes,
old
yes.
style arts. And it's very interesting because I think when you go and sometimes it's these extracurricular things like going and looking at the armor and you have these experiences where you really feel like in Tibetan Buddhism they talk about they call like the warm breath of the Dakini, which is like that
Mm,
the lineage is alive. So it's
mm,
like you feel like that not like something you read in a book and it's dead, but you actually feel this live transmission of like energy, right? Like you're like, whoa, wait, there's something here. So it's interesting how you said before about in the context of fighting that it's almost like something is transmitted from one person to the other. Because I
Yeah.
think also in the context of teaching, and maybe this kind of illuminates the relationship, right, between fighting and teaching, is that it's like you give the student all the tools, you teach them the curriculum, and you give them tips and corrections and stuff. But then it's that moment where you went and you saw that sword and you saw that armor, that the energy of and the spirit and the kind of nebulous stuff that really gives it its gestalt
Hmm.
was able to come into you. And it's I think that there's a solid argument with this stuff to say, hey, you know what? Maybe we're projecting it. Maybe this stuff doesn't come from the world outside of us, but either way it feels like it does.
It does, yeah.
And
You're
that's what matters.
and you're connected to people who, in my opinion, and I think DT Suzuki mentioned this. I have to try to find. There's an audiobook for it. I want to find the hardcover. All of it is out of print. It's called Zen and the Samurai. And DT
Yes.
Suzuki. Yeah, you've heard that one, right?
Well,
Is
it's
it?
funny. I had a copy in my college library when I was at Bridgeport, and I read it while I was there because I first thing I did when I got there was like, let's see what kind of martial arts books they got in the library.
What I mean, what a fabulous book! And he said at one point he was talking about Uesugi Kenshin and Takeda Shingen, and these were Zen devotees. They wrote haiku. They
Yeah,
did calligraphy. They did painting. Aside from being these genius military strategists of mass warfare, but also masters of the sword. And at one point, DT Suzuki said, "What type of marvelous men they must have been to be in their presence, what it must have been like, you
yeah,
know, that such men even existed, that they were endeavoring to reach level upon level and upon level of perfection within themselves." And I think that's what we're experiencing. I think that's what we're receiving.
yeah,
That these people, as human as they were, right? Although they were endeavoring, right? They were also involved in things that were like, oh my God, this is horrible. But some of them were endeavoring to these higher levels. And I think, and I'm going to bring this here. This is a Bugay peace sword. This is a very important piece to me because this is, if I'm not mistaken, one of the last swords that were overseen QC wise by the late Keith Larman at Bugay. He was a Japanese martial arts scholar, right? I believe he received a degree in this. This is meaning that something like this receives all of that energy. This receives it. And when you get that kind of, let's say, when I pass this on to someone else, not only are they receiving the tool, they're receiving the thousands and millions of reps that I've held it in a particular posture, or even moved with it, or even blocked with it, or just gave it my energy, where they will receive that knowledge and that energy. They may even be the same, right? If you've ever received a tool from somebody, like I'm lucky enough to own several bagwells, I feel like at times, he told me this also, let the knife teach you. Don't try to impose. Let the knife teach you how to move. And I'm so lucky because it's like he put himself in the knife,
yeah,
so that whenever I move with it, I'm always finding new details. And I believe the sword is the same, in
yeah.
that the knowledge and the energy, when they pass on the energy, you receive the knowledge.
I think also, it's so much again like it's the relationship and it's the system because we can't give these things to anyone, right? To the wrong person, that
Oh,
endowment doesn't come to fruition, right?
yeah.
And it's a very fascinating like way of teaching. I mean, I think this is gets into like kind of like, the older way of instruction. But when something like that is passed on, there's a deep commitment to practice that comes with it, like a sense of reverence and this desire to investigate what the teacher has left for us, right? And I think that this is a very powerful way. And sometimes people don't realize, but these types of gestures, these types of symbolic um, giving and exchange of a special item like this can be pivotal in somebody's development and training, right? Like it can be the moment that kind of like puts you on the path to become, to bring your martial arts to the next level, right? And I think that this is something we don't really understand so well in the Western context because we've boiled it down to technical instruction and things that are easy to codify, you know?
American culture lacks reverence. There's this imperfect, but I think conceptually a beautiful movie. I think it was Sidney Lumet directed it. It had Benicio del Toro. It had Tommy Lee Jones. It was The Hunted, and I believe that movie had greater ambitions in terms of trying to address what we're talking about, beyond just this typical actioner by the time it got released. But there was a line in the movie, and again, these are both special forces. They were trained in knife arts. And at one point in the line where Benicio del Toro's character was being hunted, he was taunting the people hunting him. And the line still stands out to me. He said, "You have no reverence." That's what he was
Mm.
telling the hunters, meaning you're just going out there to kill with these superior tools. You have no reverence for the world that you're taking from, which you happen to be a part of, right? And that's one thing that I find in swordsmanship, both in the Filipino sense, in the Bowie knife sense, and in the Japanese sense. It's one of the last places that humanity can find reverence, which is different from worship. Okay,
Yes.
because worship, there is superior and inferior, right? There's a superior being that you are asked, and you're always asked. It's like a one-way relationship. Please give me this. Please give me that. And
There also often like is a fetishization, right,
oh,
with
such a good
worship
word.
where it has to be that
Yeah,
that like I can't appreciate anything else. Like
yes,
I converted, I became Christian. Now I have to listen to Christian rock music. I can't listen
yes.
to regular music.
It's a
You know?
fetish.
Yeah, like you need it. It's not just something you enjoy or revere, right?
And I think fetish is a good word because anything outside of that is a threat to
Yes.
them.
Yes.
Reverence is equal, right? You have equal stature. And as much as I may look at a sword and go, holy smokes, this is amazing, but I'm at the end of the day the user.
Yeah.
I'm the practitioner. And so I'm the person in command of this. But I have to be careful because this can overtake me also. So there's always this nice little dance with it, right? So
It's
that's
not
rep.
so different than how a intelligent person regards a gun, right? Like it's like this is a powerful tool of life and death, you know, and we you treat it with reverence and respect, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I find that there's a little added nuance to the sword in that there's a type of it can do other things too, right? You can
Yes,
prep with it,
the
uh,
utility.
there's
Yes.
a utility to it, but also the fact that it's handed down like so many generations, and that's one thing I appreciate. But to your point about guns, no, that's like it's awe, but also this like it can be very destructive, right?
Yes.
And this is where what's Yagyu Minori, he talks about it in this book. The term for it is katsuninto, setsuninto. Setsuninto means to take life, right? The sword can take life.
Yes.
Katsuninto is that it gives life.
Gives
It gives
life.
life right back to you. And I like to say this on my own channel that 99.999% of your life, you're never gonna pick up a stick, like go and abanico somebody in the head, and that's it. You defended your whole family, their honor, whatever. You're never gonna do that. I'm never gonna backcut somebody and defend. But the rest of your life is the consistent practice of this. And this is where it is life giving. This is where it's katsuninto.
Yeah.
It's given more to me. And I really feel this in here when I say this. My martial art practice has given more to me than I've been able to give back to it. I'm the very happy and grateful recipient because, to your point, the energy, the fact that it keeps me injury free, right? I do my lifting. I have no shoulder issues and I'm 53. I don't have back issues and I'm 53, even though my lifts are over 1,000, right? So, but I have no major injuries. I don't even have an injury, not even a minor one. But I credit that to my martial practice. It gives back.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's so many ways where, the martial practice is generative and that it has this sort of like life-giving formula. I think there's a really so I want to get into this a little bit before we have to wrap up just
Yeah,
because of time. But so I kind of had an insight around the sword while we were talking today, and it kind of comes on the level of psychology, like a sort of like a little bit of a Jungian model. But I think that part of what's going on, why we have so much, why the sword is so energetically potent, um, is that the blade, right, is a symbol, obviously, of death and destruction and killing. But it has no agency of its own. It has to be animated by the user, right? And it has to be first constructed by the maker, right? So this kind of gets into like, why do we have this notion that the sword is imbued with energy from the maker? Well, because it has to be, right? It's energy, it's physical energy that makes the sword. It's the maker's mental energy that designs and constructs its shape, right? And that's influenced by all of the people that came before. So there's a lineage, right, of the maker, and then now there is a lineage of the user, and the user comes to this like symbol, right, of death, right? But ultimately, the sword is a symbol of death, but it has to be animated by the user. So in this, the user, by putting their energy through the sword, gives life to the sword, which
beautiful,
animates the latent qualities already in the sword, right? And that
beautiful.
relationship now between the maker, the sword, and the user has this very potent energy of life and death. So there's all of this movement of energy, and you end up with a very rich kind of like tapestry of sensation and all these things. So it kind of makes sense. Like, hey, why do we pick up a old samurai sword and swing it around and get chills? Well,
Yeah,
there's things going on.
there's things going on, time space with the sword, and then the user, time and space. And to me, this whenever I pick up any sword, right, or a Bowie knife, a sword, Um, to me, that's me experiencing quantum collapse. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a Rolando Estocada thing because it's many hands have led to this, and who knows how many billions of years led to the materials, the making of the materials, the billions of years that this universe took to create me. But then, to your point, the sword has no agency until you have this quantum instantaneous collapse the minute my hands hold it. Now the warrior supposedly comes out. Now this setsuninto comes in, but it doesn't happen until you have this quantum collapse.
It's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think also, the relationship between the weapon and the user can be a stand-in for the relationship between the fighter and the opponent. And I think
Oh,
this is where like the Chinese martial arts and even Aikido get into their usage of weapons where and like we can see with Aikido that the fundamentals aren't exactly right according to proper schools of Japanese swordsmanship, but that the underlying idea is that the interaction between the user and the weapon is very similar to, say, manipulating a forearm, right?
mhm,
Like if I can get used to manipulating the sword, right, then it's very similar to manipulate somebody in these locks or movements of the arm. So this was kind of how my Chinese martial arts teacher approached the weapons, that it was a chance to work with extending our mind outside of our own body,
yes,
and working with manipulating an object that's a little bit simpler than a living, breathing opponent.
yes. I know that Yagyu Munenori mentions that in his writings. Your mind has to go. He said there were three of them: shoulders, elbow, hands, and then ultimately into the sword. And all of it has to connect. But he didn't talk about it in terms of anatomy. He talked about it in terms of mind. Like it
Yeah.
has to go through. Yeah, that's absolutely spot on.
One thing that you brought up that I think is really fascinating is you were talking about fascial lines, right? And
Yeah,
this is something that I've been diving really deep into. And I've kind of come up with a little like quippy little thing here, which is basically like what you want is to have loose fascia and strong muscles. And most of the time people have one or the other or neither, right? They have strong muscles, tight fascia, loose fascia, weak muscles, or weak fascia, loose fascia and weak, tight
yeah,
fascia and weak muscles, and it's really
yeah,
bad.
yeah,
Um, but when we look at martial arts movements, right? When we look at these postures like the kamae, right?
uh-huh.
Or in Tai Chi or each one, right? We have the standing postures, right? And then we look at the different movements, like the basic, like cuts, like the suburi. Um, it's really interesting to look at how it reflects the fascial lines. And this is
Yes.
something we spoke about a little bit in the city. And you know, you got into this idea that really got me thinking, which is that a lot of times people have fascial lines, they have movements, they have things that are actually they're cut off from, that their system doesn't move that way because it doesn't feel safe to them, right? And that knife work, especially because of this potent energy that we're working with, is a way to energize those lines and
Yeah.
start to open this up. Do you think you could just talk a little bit about maybe like your own experience with that process? Because this is something that I'm really, really interested in.
I yes, because a lot of my myofascial conversations, I would say source material is Tom Myers, you know,
Yeah.
opponent of it, right? And I had a chance to speak to him in person about it. But in a nutshell, because we live in the kind of society we live in, where everything is really in the sagittal plane, we walk in the sagittal plane, we're on the computer with the sagittal plane, everything is in this plane. We never really do any of these circular movements that explore all these other planes of movement. And when we look at the anatomy from a mechanistic view, where it's just a bunch of pulleys and levers, right? That's the muscular system. But the myofascial system is a circular matrix. If I move this way, the tissue itself will start to reform itself into that movement. Unlike
Yeah.
the bicep, I could do this all day. The bicep is always going to go in this line, but the myofascial line will actually reshape itself according to your intention, but also
Mm.
according to your movement. And as somebody who likes to lift, and lifting, especially if it's a substantial load, is only one plane at a time. But then when I put the load down and I start to go to work, that's one plane at a time, also, right? Uh, so the idea with knife work is that I get to explore the myofascial system so that it's more multiplanar. If I have a Bowie knife, this is a multiplanar movement. I'm exploring all of it. And in my own experience, a lot of this really came to with two systems: the Illustrissimo system meaning the use of a Filipino sword. And the reason why the Filipino sword, the only real difference, in my opinion, one of the main differences with Filipino versus Japanese systems is that this is a unilateral movement. I'm only using one part of the body that's loaded, meaning one part of the body is loaded.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of what's called shoulder decoupling, meaning as this
Yeah.
is protracting, this is retracting, right? And
Yeah.
I'm only getting load feedback from one part of my body that's segmented. So the fact that it's an asymmetrical loading, my fascia has to accommodate for that. Like, wow, I got to be really loose here. I have to be really alive here. So I'm going to give you an example with the Bowie knife. If I do not know how to externally rotate from the shoulder and do this back cut, I'm going to borrow from my spine and try to do the
Ah,
cut because I don't have access to it. If I have an impinged shoulder and I try to, okay, uh, Jamie, I want you to do the back cut and external cueing, hit him on top of the head. Well, your nervous system is just gonna, well, I don't have access to the shoulder. I did something stupid and I messed up my shoulder. I'm gonna back cut like this. Tactically bad, but also it's no longer a multiplanar movement. But if I know with enough reps, I start to ease any sort of scar tissue or limitation and explore that, something strange happens. Your access to that movement frees up. Any stored energy in the scar tissue, right, or in the impingement, release.
Yeah. And it's the same as like what happens on the energetic level is that you have the physical bound scar tissue, but you have
Yep.
energy, you have bound libido, and when you free that, right, you have more energy going through the system.
And the energy goes out. Like you feel all of it going through your fingers,
Yes.
through the limbs. You feel it go into the sword.
This is why everybody gets into the no touch knockout who feels this stuff, right? Is because somebody I think it was Chu Song Ting who said it. He's a Wing Chun guy, but I just love how genuine he was about it. He's like, yeah, I was doing this stuff and I started to feel things. I felt things going down my arm and coming out of my fingers, and it felt so strong that I was sure that something must be coming out of my fingers. So I did a number of experiments for a month, seeing if anything was coming out of my fingers. Nothing came out of my fingers. It turns out, he goes, it turns out that there's nothing coming out of your fingers, but it does really feel like that. And it is important for martial arts.
It is. I love that.
Yeah, he's like,
What was it? Unlimited power.
yes, yes.
No, 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 emperor. No, no, that's not how that works. But the idea that when you do this for years and years and thousands of reps, you don't have a reactive organism anymore. You have a responsive organism.
Yes.
So that, all right, I'm going to use my head for instance. I can push on the chin this way, but if I go, all right, now the entire organism is locked up. This is how you can catch me in a jiu-jitsu match. It's like he's here, oh, he's caught here. All right, I'm gonna do side mount this way because he
Yeah.
has a restriction here. But how else is that restriction now affecting the rest of my life? And what will happen if somehow there is no restriction? When your body is unbounded, not only from a myofascial tensegrity standpoint, but myofascia has, if I'm not mistaken, the highest amount of neurotransmitters and
Yeah.
neuroreceptors compared to muscle. So now you have, okay, neural receptors that are going out into the world. I think that's what your colleague was talking about, energy going out into the world.
Yeah.
Your neural receptors are like, bring it. What's out there? So that I can respond and react to it. What's out there so that I'm really super responsive. So now it's not a fear based reaction. I'm ready to engage with the world. So now you're just a positive person. Somebody look
Yeah.
at you and says, hey, bro, what's going on? I'm good. Hey, bro, F you. Have a good day. You're just,
Yep.
but none of it is locked in. It's this
Yes.
really instantaneous response that's natural and instinctive, and your identity is bound to it.
Yeah. No, I mean that's beautiful. And I think that's the core of like personal work. Like some people would call it the great work, right? But it's just how do we start to identify these places where our personal, our physical, our mental energy has gotten bound up, right? These like knots, right? And unbind them and free that energy. There was something kind of an interesting theme throughout the whole conversation today about, the idea of time and space. And I think there's
Yeah.
something funny about movement here too that you touched on, which is that, you know, all of our life is in that sagittal plane, linear, going places, walking somewhere, typing, doing something, right? And it's in that timeline of time and space. But when you pick up the knife, when you pick up the
Yeah.
sword, when you go to do martial arts, when you slap bump, right? And you change from that linear oriented movement into this circular S-curved yin yang, figure eight shape movement. It's like that's also part of getting outside time and space, getting outside the time and space of the rat race of our culture. Is like, how do you step out of that into the present moment? And then, this is what meditation is for, right? And meditation helps with this, but that can be such an austere training ground for a mind that's inundated with Instagram and, advertising and all of these things that are going on, right? It's a lot to just sit there and stop. So to have this combination of circular movement practice, energy work. Maybe even there's a symbolic element like a knife or a sword, right? That lends this power to what we're doing, right? And that's going to allow us to open this up and step out of that time and space. So as much as stepping out of time and space for the experienced martial artist, for the master, is something you do to your student. How did you do that, right? It's also why students enjoy training, is that they get to step outside their normal time and space and into something else.
Yeah, and time and space in the sense of, it can be limiting. There's that, but limiting in the sense of, you're not just practicing because you're trying to get in touch with a type of culture, like a national identity, right? You're not just moving because, well, I'm practicing a Filipino martial art because I'm Filipino, or I'm practicing a Japanese martial art because I want to get closer to the Japanese culture, which is one level. Ultimately, in my opinion, I think I only arrived at this through swordsmanship. It's through swordsmanship where that kind of S-curve circularity, you're getting in touch with the cosmic identity of the warrior archetype. How many thousands and thousands of students have done these types of movements through all of history, and not just in history, but also in the future? So you're connected to all those students in the past and in the future, in this dimension, in other dimensions, in this universe, in other universes, in all of these incarnations, not just as students, but also as masters, and also not just as a receiver, but also as giver. And this is what centers, in my opinion, these types of martial artists who are devotees of the sword and the knife, because they go beyond the need for happiness, or as we like to say in America, the pursuit of happiness, because even happiness is finite. But you arrive at a cosmic identity that you settle in, that connects you to all things through this one practice. It sounds kind of woo woo, but
Yeah.
that's been my reality, but also the reality I've read about, that
So
you connect to cosmic identity.
I think that, there's something that it's funny, like my Tai Chi teacher who I studied with for about 10 years, he passed recently. And, you know,
Mm, mm,
through it, you kind of go back through everything they've ever said. And one of the things that he said that he was always harping on about was the yin yang, the Taiji diagram. He says everybody gets confused about this thing. Everybody looks at it and they say, this is a symbol. It's not a symbol. It doesn't represent anything. It's a diagram. It's showing you the movement of the joints. It's showing you how substantial and insubstantial, tension and relaxation moves throughout the articulating surface of the joint. And it's also telling you how the mind works, that when you push towards substantial, there'll always be a following component of insubstantial. When you push towards insubstantial, there'll always be this following component of substantial, that you have to have both, right? So I think when we talk about, you say, oh, it's kind of woo-woo, but you're connecting to all this stuff. You're connecting, and you said this, through that S curve, because the
yeah.
S curve goes from the physical level. It's the way the physical joints work, right? Like if you were to cut open my wrist and look at the surface of the radius and the ulna, right, where it articulates, that
Hmm.
it's basically a yin yang.
Yeah, that's what it
How
is.
does
Yeah,
it
that's right.
how does it do this without getting tangled? Because
Exactly.
it's following that movement, right? But then also when we look at how the mind works, it's the same thing. And the fascia, right, is the membrane that goes between those layers, right? So it carries the intent of that S curve from your mind out into your body. So, you know,
Oh.
I think that there's this really beautiful kind of like layout here, and this kind of, it sounds woo-woo, but on a practical level, we actually have a roadmap for how you can take your martial arts practice from physical to energetic, mental. I don't even really like to call it spiritual because I think you have to master those energetic and mental levels first. And then
Yes,
if there's a connection to something greater, right, it would have to come after the self is resolved.
I 100%. What a beautiful and really fascinating way to put it together. It might require another conversation.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
that one thing that I will say as we wrap up here today is I started this podcast, really thinking for the martial arts community, thinking, I have experience learning many different arts and I have access to an amazing number of incredible martial artists and people who are willing to come on and talk to me. Um, but what's ended up happening is that I've experienced an incredible growth in my own practice, in my own art, through the 35 or so hours I've spent talking to you guys. So I gotta say, I really appreciate you. I want to say thank you to you and all of the guests who have come on and not only shared their knowledge with all of the audience, but also helped me to grow and develop.
I thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to discuss these things that I generally don't discuss on my own channel. We're not there yet, but I think the time will come. So I thank you for giving me this opportunity, but also you've given me so much with this. With the membranes, the S curve. That this is a diagram for the reality we live in. That's very beautiful. So I've received a lot from you. Thank you.
Well, we'll have to come back and do this again and keep it going.
Yes, yes,
Looking forward
definitely.
to it.
Yes, same
Well,
here. Same here,
thank
my
you
friend.
so much. This was wonderful. I hope everybody enjoyed